Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the live stream with David Spratt and the Climate Accord Working Group. It's a pretty exciting night and I hope you really enjoy what David has to impart to us and also the working group and the wonderful work that they're doing. This is being recorded and we will stick to 50 minutes or less. That's our goal. So it's great that you've joined us tonight. I'm Julie Lyford. I'm currently the Chair of Women's Environmental Leadership, WELA. I'm a former nurse, a counsellor, a climate campaigner since 1989, a coal and gas activist, and I'm wearing my Rising Tide earrings because the blockade of the Newcastle port will happen in November, so join us if you can. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming here to you from Warramai and Biripi country, which is Gloucester, New South Wales, and these lands have never been ceded, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge all the lands that we're all coming together on tonight. Thanks to the MPs and minor parties and campaigners that have joined us, you are in a constant struggle to engage the public on issues that matter. You are leaders, and that's why we're engaging you, whether you're an MP, a candidate, or supporting a party, or even an independent, and they're doing some fantastic work. I hope we can all agree that a safe climate is the most immediate and critical issue because it is one of survival of us and the planet. We're going to hear a 20-minute presentation by David Spratt on a paper released last week by the National Centre for Climate Restoration, breakthroughonline.org.au. We'll send all these links to you later. There is a link to the paper posted in the live stream chat if you wanted to pop over to that. And the presentation is not just on how bad it is, because we all know that, it's actually what the solutions are. So that's where our focus really needs to be. And how is climate rescue different? We are in the climate end game, but there's something lacking in the climate conversations we are having, and that is vision. And that's what we're wanting to impart to you tonight. And I'm sure a lot of you have vision as well. We dream of stopping a coal mine. This is my kind of, basics. Sorry about that. We dream of stopping a coal mine, shutting down a coal plant, stopping new gas, rewilding, sustainable agriculture, and we even dream of bringing integrity to government. And we know there is some integrity in government, but we need a lot more of it, and that's moral integrity, because there's a lot of moral culpability at the moment not addressing our climate issues. None of these actions alone, though, will get us where we need to be for a safe climate and a safe future. There is a ground shift in rural communities, and they're unifying, as we had the rally last week in Sydney for the coal seam gas issue in Narrabri. The Great Barrier Reef is a classical example of greenwashing, while the trajectory of heating and devastation continues. Winning slowly means losing. What does that mean? We need the immediate call and the urgency to be recognised and actioned immediately, and that's the key. What we don't hear in the climate end game is anyone talking about stopping heating, let alone restoring a safe climate. The Climate Rescue Accord is about that vision, because for work that is so gargantuan, we can't get there if we don't have a vision, and that needs to guide our strategy. That's what we're introducing tonight, the vision and the strategy. And what do you want to get out of tonight? Climate rescue buy-in, an understanding of the horror as well as the solutions, and a positive vision for the future. We need some commitment to campaign on climate rescue, and we need your engagement in this campaign. So I'm going to hand over now to David. David Spratt is Research Director for the National Centre for Climate Restoration and co-author of Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action. And I can tell you now, all the knitting nanas in New South Wales have read this and are very engaged for many years in David's work. David's work on climate science, tipping points and existential risk, and on climate politics and the climate emergency has been translated into 7 languages. David deconstructs IPCC climate science and, working with climate scientists, reconstructs what is known into an actual way out of our current trajectory. David wants you to know that his presentation will be available to you after the event. The paper, Accelerating Climate Disruption and the Strategy to Reduce, Remove and Repair, the 3 Rs, was released on the 13th of September. The Climate Rescue Accord Working Group, following David's presentation, will present the Accord goals and the next steps. So with no further ado, I hand you over to David Spratt.
Thanks, Julie. I will share my screen, and we hope this will all work. Have we got what we want on the screen?
That's
Julie,
all good.
good? Yep. Okay. So as we know, we've had some incredible events in the climate system recently. It seems to be accelerating and disrupting. July was 1.45 degrees warmer than pre-industrial. August 1.68, which is sort of mind-blowing. And so there's been record heat. There's also been record surface temperatures, sea surface temperatures around the world. So the heat is really building up, and it's leading people, scientists, to say things like this: we're hitting record-breaking extremes much sooner than I expected. That's frightening, scary, and concerning, and it really suggests we're not aware of what's coming up as we thought we were. That's Sarah Perkins from the University of New South Wales, and Walt Meyer, one of the great glaciologists, talking about Antarctica. It's so far outside anything we've seen, it's almost mind-blowing. So that's a sort of response to the disruption we're seeing at the moment. I just want to sort of ask a question: where are we going? And this graphic is really, this is the really stunning. This is the US government's projection of emissions from the electricity sector out to 2050. And you can see it's going from there to there. It's only going to drop 20% by 2050. So while governments might talk about net zero, in fact, this is not net zero, this is not zero. And the same thing is happening in Australia. If we look at the emissions since 2005, that is in 17 years, have dropped 1.4% in total if you exclude the land use change. So in terms of actual greenhouse gas emissions, they've actually gone up in the last 10 years. This is from the Financial Times. This is estimates of what the three largest exporters of liquid natural gas will do over the next 10 years. And those three big ones are Australia, Qatar, and the US. And between now and 2030, the amount of LNG that they're planning to export will actually double. And so the UNFCCC, the UN's climate body, says by 2030, emissions might be 0.3% lower than 2019. That is, in the next 10 years, emissions are not going to drop sharply as is necessary. We can remember a few years ago, scientists said, if you want a chance of 2 degrees, emissions have got to halve between 2020 and 2030. And that is simply not going on the current indications. Here's a really important graph that explains something what's going on. So when you burn fossil fuels, a byproduct of sulfur products called sulfate aerosols, sulfur dioxide, which are in the atmosphere for a short period of time, but they have a really strong cooling effect before they're rained out. And that cooling effect of sulfate aerosols traditionally said to be 0.5 degree. Jim Hansen says up to 1.5 degrees. So if those sulfates weren't a byproduct of fossil fuels, the system would already be 1 degree hotter than it is. And we can see that impact in this chart on the left, where it was decided to reduce the amount of sulfates in shipping because they use very dirty bunker oil. And you can see after 2019, this grey line, the amount of sulfates coming out of ships dropped to almost zero. And then the amount of energy imbalance in the system went up, which might be a clue to what's happening at the moment. So in terms of Earth's energy imbalance, which is the difference between the amount of radiation coming and going at the top of the atmosphere. So Earth's energy imbalance is actually an indicator of the amount of warming in the system or future warming. And you can see it's really ramping up, particularly in the last few years. And that current amount is probably equivalent to another degree of warming. So that's more or less colloquially what's in the system at the moment. So that's why Jim Hansen, often known as the godfather of modern climate science, the former director of climate science to NASA, says that he thinks warming will accelerate in the next period because we're losing that that temporary aerosol cooling. In fact, you know, we've just had a couple of months. A couple of months is not a trend, but we've had a couple of months even warmer than his projection. So he's saying that increased Earth imbalance means that warming will accelerate by as much as 50 to 100% in the next few decades. That is, the amount of warming per decade from now on will be greater than it has been up till now. And what are the consequences of this? A very interesting piece of work which came out earlier this year, where people said, looking in the future, this is probably 20, 55, 30 odd years away, where in the Earth will there be temperatures that humans have never previously experienced outside historically experienced temperatures? And these are areas in summer, obviously in the hot season, where it would be practically too hot to live without an air conditioner. And this is what they came up with. And you can see it's a quarter of Australia, as well as a good bit of India and Pakistan and Southeast Asia and across the Middle East, Africa and the Amazon. So in these areas, it may not be possible to live in summer without air conditioning. In fact, Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute said a third of the planet would be uninhabitable, and that's maybe 30 years away. That heat is going to, and other impacts on crop yields, are likely to drop crop yields by 25 to 50% across Australia. Look at India, look at China, look at the United States. So we're going to have a real decrease in crop yields. And so we're seeing the sort of stories we're getting now. The US Special Envoy 2 weeks ago in Australia talking about a food shortage in August because of the extreme weather there. India, the largest exporter of rice in the world, banned all rice exports. China has got similar food security problems, and El Nino in itself will threaten the world rice supply. So food and water are pretty much at the basis of what we do. So a great report was done by Chatham House, the leading UK think tank, 2 years ago, a climate risk assessment, where they looked at all the climate hazards relating to food and water, rainfall, heat waves, weather patterns, extreme events, and then worked their way systematically through the consequences. And here's what they came up with. They said, and this is by 2050, they said, climate disruption will cause social tensions, unrest, protests, riots, which will lead to state failure, that is, governments failing, large-scale migration and conflict. So that is where we're heading. And then they looked at the more systemic risks, so not only food and water, but things like health and pests and business disruption. And they came up with a list of what they thought climate change would produce by 2050, which is, as you can see, large-scale migration and displacement of people, both internally and externally, armed conflict, the rise of extremist groups, conflict between people and states, civil war and war. And in terms of the economy, fall in asset prices, rapidly rising commodity prices, falling stock markets, and last of all, financial market collapse. So Chatham House, whose charts we just saw, said they think by 2050, on the current trajectory, the one we're on, that cascading climate impacts will drive political instability and greater national insecurity and fuel regional and international conflicts. So that's where we're heading. So we're at about 1.2 degrees trend at the moment, even though we've had these 1.5s. In the long run, over centuries, each 1 degree will result in 10 to 20 meters of sea level rise. That rate will keep on going like that. It's well established it will be at 1.5 by 2030. In fact, perhaps before. We're certainly up or close to a 1.5 degree year for the year that started in the middle of this year. On present trends, we will be at 2 degrees before 2050. Why does this matter? Well, because of that sulfate problem, when you reduce fossil fuels, you reduce the sulfates, you remove the cooling, and you get more warming. So, and this is why it's in red, reducing emissions alone will have no significant impact on warming trends over the next 2 years. That's not a reason not to reduce emissions, but relying on reducing emissions to bend down the curve in the short run will simply not work because of the aerosol dilemma. In red, mitigation alone, and this is part of our strategy, will not stop 2 degrees of warming. Of course, the situation is already dangerous. Just at 1.2 degrees, we have already passed tipping points for the Arctic sea ice, for coral reefs, and for the poles at both north and south, and for Amazon. That is, those systems are already moving to a discretely different state. And there's a cluster of further tipping points will happen between 1.5 and 2, that is, before 2050, in the next 30 years. The other point to be made is that 2 degrees is not a point of system stability. By the time you get to 2 degrees, there are so many feedbacks in the system, as Rockstrom from the Potsdam Institute says. If we go beyond 2 degrees, it's very likely we have caused so many tipping points that you've probably added another degree. So we're actually heading towards 3 degrees, which US intelligence analysts say would likely result in war and outright conflict around the world. So that's where we're headed. Will Steffen, the great Australian scientist who died earlier this year, says there's a critical point in all of this beyond which we lose control of the system. We lose control of the system. Where's that point? I think it's not above 2 degrees. I think it's between 1.5 and 2, and some scientists have said that, which is where we're heading. So this is our great existential dilemma. And John Schellenhuber, the former director of the Potsdam Institute, says, if we continue down the present path, there's a very big risk that we will just end our civilizations. Human species will survive, but we will destroy what we have built up. And that, I think, is the truth of the matter. Don't look at the chart. It's a fancy way of saying the following. Whoops. Climate change is an existential risk, so particular focus must be given to one question, and this is really important. In red, what is the plausible worst case scenario, and what do we have to do to avoid it? And that's a question I want to answer. And the worst case scenario is that we will get to 2 degrees in the next 30 years, and there'll be so many feedbacks that the system will run away from us. So what's safe? You will talk a lot about a safe climate. Andrew King from the University of Melbourne. From a geologic perspective, a justifiable aim is one akin to pre-industrial conditions, that is, taking the atmosphere back to where it was before we started putting fossil fuels in the atmosphere, that is 280 parts per million. James Hansen, the great NASA scientist, we will need to return to a global climate no warmer than the middle of the 20th century and somewhat cooler. And in the middle of the 20th century, the warming was about 1/4 degree. And Schellenhuber, likewise, our survival may well depend on how much we're able to draw down CO2 back to 280, back to pre-industrial. So this is what a safe climate is, going back to where we were before fossil fuels drove up greenhouse gases by more than 50%. So how do we do that? Schematically, impacts and temperature up on this scale, time. This is our path of emissions just going up and up and up. If we get to zero fast, we can obviously bend that temperature and impacts curve down. But if that danger level for the system running away from us is down here, which I think is reasonable, then obviously getting to zero is not enough. So what else can we do? We can draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that will slowly reduce the temperature and the impacts back to a safe level over time. But we've still got this long period of time, perhaps, most of the rest of this century, when the temperature and the impacts are going to be above that critical level. And so the only way to answer that dilemma is to try and actively cool the planet for that period of time until the drawdown can work. So that is what is called the 3 lever strategy to reduce, remove, and repair. So in red, active cooling is vital. I fear that if we don't have active cooling, then we will trip tipping points and a cascade of warmings that will take the climate system beyond the capacity of humans to control it and for human civilization to survive. In our report, which Julie mentioned, which I'll show in a minute, the sort of carbon drawdown, carbon dioxide removal options are the nature-based solutions like building up ecosystems, regenerative land management, marine upwelling, iron fertilization, and then there are technical solutions, negative emissions constructing using wood instead of cement for construction and so on. And in terms of cooling, there's a work that some of you may know of by Ye Tao about surface mirrors to reflect more radiation back, marine cloud brightening, which is being tested in Queensland at the moment. The big one, solar radiation management, that is putting some sulfates back in the atmosphere to cool it down. Some of these are obviously well established, like ecosystem sequestration. Some of them are tentative and some of them haven't been proved. But that's the range of options we need to look at. So Sir David King and the Climate Crisis Group in the UK have termed this language, which we've adopted, of reduce emissions urgently, remove CO2, and repair the system by cooling. So as Julie said, we released a report last week called Accelerated Climate Disruption and the Strategy to Reduce, Remove and Repair, which summarises the argument I've just given to you. It can be downloaded from the site at the bottom. And to reiterate the main messages out of my talk, zero emissions at emergency speed within a decade is crucial. But the Earth is already too hot. We're seeing that at the moment with the incredible events around the world, and large-scale carbon drawdown is vital. The third, that damage is and will become dangerous before these longer-term solutions are effective. So a safe means of immediate cooling is critical to protect people and nature and return us to a safe climate. And that's the end of my talk. I'll just leave that up for 1 second. If you want to email us, info@breakthroughonline.org.au, and we can send you this PowerPoint if you would like a copy. And thanks very much, Julie. And I hope I was almost within time.
Actually, you were fantastic. So you were 5 minutes early.
Oh, well, that's
so
good.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Wow, that was a pretty profound. I haven't actually been exposed to a lot of this work for a while, and wow, it's some pretty fascinating solutions there.
It's a big story that needs some big, courageous political leadership in response.
Absolutely. Is there anything that you, just because you did finish so early, and I know we're going on to the working group now, and please, for people watching, put some questions in the chat that will be monitored. And if the questions aren't answered tonight, they will be answered in a newsletter further on in a couple of weeks. But David, is there something that you personally really want to kind of say to people that are listening about your work?
Well, I mean, when we did our book Climate Code Red, a journalist rang me up and, said, "What do you think?" And I was doing a few things, and I said, "Well, look, the problem with climate politics is that people think you can negotiate with the laws of physics and chemistry." And it actually turned up in an editorial in The Age that next Saturday. And I hadn't thought about that, but I mean, there's this assumption in politics that everything is subject to negotiations to deal, a bit for me, a bit for you, a trade-off. I mean, that's how all politics work. But when we come to the Earth system, we actually can't negotiate with the Earth system. If we don't do the right thing, it will simply roll along and roll over us. So, I mean, I think we have to be brutally honest about the science. We can't negotiate with it, as policymakers tend to. The other thing I think that is important and really is encouraging, I think recognition of these three levers is now really on the public agenda compared to even 5 years ago. I'm seeing more and more people, even people working for NGOs, saying, yeah, look, I can see your point now. We do need these three. And obviously, a lot of the drawdown options are already available. And I think there's a really appreciation. The fact that Sir David King, who was the chief scientist in the UK for 12 years, he advised 2 Labor prime ministers and 1 Conservative prime minister, is out saying, we need to do these three things. And he's got a large group at Cambridge sort of researching this stuff, shows that these ideas are not out on the fringe. They're actually in the centre of work of some really great scientists and researchers around the world.
Wow. Oh, thank you. That was yeah, it's pretty profound stuff, and it's also pretty exciting. You know, climate despair sits with me sometimes, and it's so good to actually have this window of opportunity, kind of like that's been happening, but now becoming aware of that. And I think it will also help a lot of other people to actually become really proactive in looking at these solutions.
I mean, Julia, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, you know, this relationship between hope and despair. I mean, you know, this contradiction, how do you resolve that? And I say, look, it's neither. It's about courage. You know, it's
Absolutely.
about it's about courage to face the science that is, understand what the solutions are, and you know, and work with all our might to do it. Julie, the other thing I'll just mention is that a longer version of this, which goes through it more thoroughly, we did a couple of years in a project called Climate Reality Check. So if people want to go to climaterealitycheck.net, climaterealitycheck.net, they'll get a fuller presentation of these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Okay, we will move on to the Climate Action Working Group now. And I'd like to introduce Antoinette, Carmen, Adam, and Bryony, who will say just a quick few words about themselves. So over to you, and then that will be for 10 minutes, and then we will go into a Q&A.
No worries. I think I'm up first. Thank you, Julie. My name's Antoinette. I am from the Australian Progressives. I'm an executive on the board for that minor political party. I'm also a nurse as well. It seems to be a common factor. I'm also a jobber, and I'm also got a recycling business of my own. And this is one of my pet things, is the environment. It's so important. So I'm just going to continue with the slides until you get to the next person. So we're from the working group of the Climate Rescue Accord. A few months ago, representatives from a number of federally registered political parties started working on a common climate framework, and this is what has come out of it. This is the name and the logo that we created for the campaign that we are starting. It's the 3 R's that Dave was just talking about: reduce, withdraw, repair. The name of the campaign is the Climate Rescue Accord, as I said, and we've got the website up and running now, which is climaterescue.net. We'll go to the next slide. So we are representatives from several federally registered parties. We're putting aside any differences that we have because we all need to get on board for this issue. Championing goals and actions that will actually save us, and demanding that current governments act on these. We are all looking at each other and we're all agreeing that the major parties have failed us. They won't even produce a roadmap to get us to zero. And they're still opening mines and subsidising our destruction. So we decided we needed to move. Next slide. Over to Adam.
So the things I'm going to cover in the next couple of slides, David covered very, very well. So I'll just highlight some key points that brought us together as a working group. And the first is that the current goals that we have around climate change are inadequate and don't actually reflect what we need, which is a safe climate. And we need a safe climate for the survival of people, animals, and the planet. At the moment, we talk about net zero. What's net zero? It's ridiculous. We talk about 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. People are giving up on 1.5 degrees. But as David's already said, that those are dangerous levels of climate change and dangerous for many other people, animals, and the planet. Next slide. 0 is just not enough. 0 will see us get into 1.5, 2 degrees and higher. And as David pointed out, that could see runaway climate change where we end up in places that we cannot live. So if we want to meet achieve a safe climate, we must go beyond just 0, certainly net 0, and we need to use all the levers that are available to us. If we look on the next slide, David went through this figure really well, but I think this is a really important figure for us to become familiar with in this campaign and the work that we do around a safe climate and climate rescue. We have to go to 0 as fast as possible. Then there's a lot of work to be done to draw down. But as David pointed out, there's this period that we may be in dangerous climate change if we don't use active cooling as safe passage from where we are now through to a point where we've drawn down enough of the carbon out of the atmosphere to be back in a safe climate. And now I'll just quickly introduce myself before I move on. My name's Dr. Adam Cardellini. I am a delegate from the Animal Justice Party. I'm liaising with the Animal Justice Party on this project, and I'm an environmental scientist in my day job. On to the next people.
Thanks, Adam. My name's Bryony Edwards, and I'm on the Fusion Executive. And I'll talk about, first of all, the Accord, the purpose of the Accord. So the purpose of the Accord is kind of what's the vision? It's to initiate, well, the vision is a safe climate and survival. And the purpose of the Accord is to get us there and initiate the required action to stop global heating, secure survival, and set a course to restore a safe climate so peoples, animals, and ecosystems can flourish. And the Accord goals that would underpin that are to hold average temperature rise to a minimum, the minimum possible, ensuring that 2 degrees is not breached or reached, and that temperatures return below 0.5 degree of warming. And that we set a course to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations to pre-industrial or safe levels based on credible scientific evidence. The actions that underpin this, these are like the non-negotiables, is to facilitate urgent R&D in the area of immediate cooling or repair strategies, that we stop fossil fuel expansion, that we stop deforestation and land use change that releases CO2 and also reduces the sequestration potential, that we stop human-induced sources of methane release. And, you know, we're over 500 parts per million if we include all the carbon dioxide equivalents that are out there. We talk about 520 in terms of CO2, but we're over 500 in terms of CO2 equivalents. And we develop an evidence-based roadmap to near zero across all sectors for emergency implementation. That includes energy, transport, consumption, manufacturing, agriculture, land use and construction. And then our general sort of theory of change or strategy for the Accord is to unify as many political groups and entities in Australia as we can. But quickly, we want to take this international as well and start talking to minor parties. The major parties, as we've said, have failed us. So we're starting with crossbenchers and minor parties. And we'll support any candidate that is campaigning on the 3 Rs, and we'll leverage action from sitting governments. And what we want from you, and I think I'm going to hand over to Carmen now.
Oh, thanks, Bryony. So my name's Carmen Leff-Jenkins, and I'm a Reason Party representative. I'm on the Reason Party executive, and I run the policy committee and write the policies for the party. I'm living in climate terror, as I'm sure many of us are. It's really scary times. And I'm really pleased to have been invited to be a part of this Accord. So thanks, Bryony, for pulling so much of this together. It's been really fantastic. And thanks, David, for frightening the absolute crap out of me even more. So our strategy is, we talked about our strategy, didn't we? But what we want from you is to sign up to our campaign at climaterescue.net. And for every minor party, every candidate, all grassroots campaign on survival and a safe climate based on the 3 Rs. So I think what we want to do now is move toward this language and how important it is for this language to shift from net zero to this reduce, the redraw, and what's the other word? The 3 Rs anyway. So we'll be going with that. So then the next steps, which Julie will also cover as well, but just very quickly to overview, will be signing up for the newsletter, establishing an Accord executive committee. So we're the working group, but there'll be an executive committee that can go forward to keep kind of driving this process, developing, which will be around policy options and taking the Climate Rescue Accord global. So, and I guess the last word is the major parties have given up. We won't survive the current path. We just won't make it unless we can focus on the 3 Rs. What we need is hope. And we'd really like you to join us in a shared strategy for climate rescue. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. That was a great overview. And now we will go to some questions. So the questions are for David and the working group to respond to. And I'll just reiterate that any unanswered questions that may be in the chat, they can be responded to after the live stream if we don't get around to all of them. So I will, there's some really good comments from Miles. Glad to hear a research-backed approach. It's often a rarity in politics. A question here, is this an argument to introduce slow lead time power sources like hydro, fusion and nuclear fission? That's pass over to you, David. You're on mute.
You're on mute, David.
Obviously, in all the in the 3 Rs, what we've got to do is what is safe, ecologically safe, and the most efficient and the lowest cost. And from that point of view, nuclear power is out because it's just so expensive. It doesn't even make it to the starting line. So I don't think we should be pejorative about technologies in general. But I mean, the test is for anything that we're going to do is it is of net social and environmental benefit. And I think that's the rule that sits above all the decisions that are made. Obviously, in a thing where we have to, because our life literally depends on it, research a really wide range of technologies, see what's feasible, see what we can get quickly down the cost curve, and take it from there with that net social and ecological environmental benefit as the guideline.
Thank you. And William has said the best drawdown method should be biological, which is following on from your comments. Self-reproduction allows scalability to global extent. Of these, ocean fertilization coupled with farming of selected phytoplankton and larger consumers, I think that and there's a yeah. So there are quite a few comments in the chat, but would the working group like to address any of the questions that we've had so far? Or are there other questions that you have heard about?
So I'll address a couple of the questions. I think that people are asking what's the best approach from here. And I think one of the things about the Climate Rescue Accord is that what we're trying to bring together is parties to campaign on the broad level accord, like the non-negotiables, but then the details on what particular parties focus on their policy platforms is really up to them as a party. But those non-negotiables of zero, drawdown, and repair are really what we're interested in in getting out there into the Australian political system and wider. And then as we set up our policy working groups, we can start to have conversations about building out those policies, and different parties will have different policies depending on their particular interests, I think, and their particular concerns.
Great. Look, and there's a couple more questions, but Simon from Fusion, the science is not negotiable, but sadly we live in a post-truth world, and having the facts and evidence is not enough to speak for itself. We have to come together to sell it. So I think that's a really great comment. Natasha's question is there any thinking about joining with Teal candidates and or Climate 200 with this accord?
So we invited the crossbench. We, sent formal invites to all crossbench members, and that, of course, including the Teals. We also invited every progressive minor party that hasn't demonstrated they're an outright climate denier in their policies and the way they talk. So yeah, absolutely. We've reached out to the Teals. I think there was some commitment for staffers to attend tonight. So that's really good.
That's great. And the second question from Ruth is, what would you want elected politicians, e.g. crossbenchers, to do right now? What are we asking? And
declare a climate emergency.
Yes.
And actually mean it, and then commit to it. There was Philip Sutton a number of years ago wrote a model climate emergency mobilisation act, and it wasn't all the detail of what would happen, but it was how government would restructure to make that change happen. And so it wasn't about the detail, and I think that's really important. It was about how government, which is just so terrible at doing, or COVID demonstrated government could do things quickly and it could mobilise at every level. But I'll leave it at that.
I think in addition to declaring a climate emergency, because I think we've seen that the climate emergency approach has been important to shift the discussion, but a lot of governments around the world have used it as a piece of performance, really, and haven't actually backed that up with action. And I think the Climate Rescue Accord is sort of building off of climate emergency, and it should happen in conjunction with a climate emergency to say, okay, we recognise there's an emergency. The actions that we need to take are zero, drawdown, and repair. And the details about some of those, like zero and drawdown, we've got a lot of science around that. Repair, a lot of some R&D needs to be done before we can make decisions, but that we need to be committing to looking into those things and getting onto them. And for zero and drawdown, we just need to do those things far faster. And I think Miles has mentioned, well, if there is a diversity of policy options, then clearly science is negotiable in a certain sense. Well, I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. I just think that there are, we are in a political world. We're talking amongst a range of different political groups who have different interests, and some things that some political groups find palatable, others may not. I know my positions on things people in this live stream probably wouldn't be particularly interested in pursuing, but I think that's in the details for specific parties.
And I think there's a really important point about the climate emergency declaration that has been made with your group, that what we're asking for is similar in some ways, but they're more broken down, and repair, which is the critical part of it, was not explicitly addressed in the climate emergency declaration. So it's pretty important. So there's one last.
Julie,
Yep.
I just want to go super simple and just say that immediately what we need to do is not open any more mines and stop subsidising fossil fuels.
Absolutely, and that's part of the work that I'm involved in, and some of us have been successful, but there's a lot out there still to, that's great. And there's just a question here from Owen. what do people feel about imposing tariffs on countries who give out fossil fuel subsidies, like Australia?
Good idea.
Yeah, it is a good idea.
Because otherwise emissions escape from country and country through trade. So border protection for fossil fuel emissions is a good form of border protection, unlike other ones which aren't.
Yeah. And so there is a question here from Bridget. What more can we do at the local government level, in your opinions? As a former local government councillor, we had a climate declaration in 2009, which is National Party heartland, very conservative council. So it's about the courage to push and the courage to actually make sure the conversation is happening. And I think local government is such a vital part of this conversation and the platform to get change. It's where we can really be effective. But I'll hand over to the panel for other comments on that.
I'd just say, even if a federal climate emergency declaration was declared, they would then turn to state and local government and say, now what are you going to do? And so they wouldn't be prescribing the actions for the local governments. The local governments would have to work it out themselves. And that's so much of that has happened since 2016, when the first local government declared a climate emergency, and a lot, councils grouped together to work out big economy of scale strategies they could pursue and so on. So that was really positive.
And we're all dealing with bushfires right now. There's one just down the road that my husband's working on, and it's started already. So I think local government is really at the forefront of seeing the actual impacts as well. Lemay, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. What are good large-scale drawdown processes that we can all engage in or encourage our groups to get involved in?
Well, I mean, look, the obvious ones are the natural-based solutions. So restoration of degraded forests is really important. Restoration of degraded wetlands is important. So I guess, the first thing to do is to undo the damage before we move forward. We say, oh, we've got to do this, but undo the damage which is being done, because the degradation of forests, the degradation of wetlands is actually driving more emissions, more methane. So they're obviously the big ones, and all those issues around restorative farming, restorative agricultural practices, because all three are available. They're being done now. They can be done at large scale, and they're not controversial. So that would be my starting trio.
And I'd add agricultural transitions that reduce the amount of animals that we produce towards plant-based agriculture releases a large amount of land that's currently used for grazing cows that can be revegetated and rewilded. Australia, in Queensland in particular, currently and a couple of years ago, had the largest levels of deforestation anywhere in the world, including in the Amazon, where they were destroying forests at an incredible rate, and that was largely for animal agriculture.
Yeah. Look, there's some great comments in the stream. I can't read them all, so apologies to everyone. It's so great to see the engagement. I was actually at a talk on Monday. Ken Henry was giving about accounting for nature. That's a little bit, controversial, I think, because we're still looking at offsets where we destroy something while we save something. But the whole talk around regenerative agriculture is really gaining traction. And Farmers for Climate Action, they're very heavily involved in all of that conversation as well. So the really exciting thing is lots of people are getting engaged in all sorts of areas on all sorts of platforms. But the exciting thing for me is actually now learning about the work that you're all doing, and this is great. It's great stuff. It's very hopeful. So we are kind of at the end of the presentations now, unless the working group or David, you wanted to have any final comments. I will wrap up with the clear message that we really want to get across. Okay, so one of the key things is campaigning vanquishes despair. We all know when we get active, as I say, November, rising tide, Newcastle port blockade, be there if you can. the climate grief, it leads to climate action. It means that we actually get involved, and obviously you're on this live stream because you're involved and you're already invested. So thank you to everybody and all the work that you're doing out there. People who struggle at the fringes often turn out to be the leaders, and the leadership that we see through the Women's Environmental Leadership Australia organisation and the programs is always inspiring. So check that out if you'd like to have a look at what's going on with Wella. Very proud of the group. And what will be our legacy as the human race? And we have run out of time now to do the same old, same old. I've been to every politician in both Parliament houses, and you know, they cannot get out of there. No one can put the spoke in the wheel. And I actually say to them, you're morally culpable for not acting. And I think that moral culpability is a word we should have on our lips when we're not aggressively, but firmly, assertively saying you are morally culpable if you don't act as a leader in a position of power. So the next steps. A short email will go to everyone attending with links and the opportunities to get involved. Sign up to the newsletter at climaterescue.net. All of these links will be in the newsletter email that you receive. The working group will be looking for interested people to join an executive committee to shape the accord going forward. Anyone interested, please get in touch. And just seeing some of the names on the live stream, there's some wealth of experience and brilliance out there. So please get in touch. Talk to others about climate rescue and the 3 Rs. If the Knitting Nanas are talking about it all over New South Wales, we should be too. We can have hope with a goal and strategy that is actually meaningful, and meaningful campaigning, as we said before, vanquishes despair. And most importantly, we want everyone, every party, every candidate, and everybody that works with them to be campaigning on the 3 Rs: reduce, redraw, and repair. Climate rescue, survival, and a safe climate. So get involved. Thank you to our panel. It's been really fabulous. And the work that you're doing is to be applauded. And thank you to everybody that's joined the live stream tonight. So go and have a good evening and get involved. You probably are already, but we need you in this as well. Thank you.